to our webinar, Reinventing Meeting via live stream. I am your host tonight. I will be chairing this discussion. I am Anna Yang, the Acting Executive Director of Hoffman Center for Sustainable Resource Economy at Chatham House. So this webinar is part of the Reinventing series that we have been hosting since last year, or even before. And the series kind of is looking at how to think about the world in a completely different way when it comes to the research that we use. Some of the previous events have been around reinventing meat, reinventing plastic bottle, reinventing building, and reinventing fashion. And if we were meeting this in a physical Chatham House space, we would be meeting after our meeting, we would be seeing an installation, and we would also be having a drink after this. So you just have to imagine the drink, but this is part of, going virtual. So if you have, in the meantime, go grab a drink, depending on where you are, because eventually this will lead to a drink. And so the Hoffman Center was set up to look at innovative possibilities on how can consumers drive a revolution in demand, and how we hope to look at how disruptions can work in practice. And obviously, in the context of today, how it can drive change and how we live and how we work. And so please note that this event is not held under Chatham House rule. So as participant, you can share ideas, you can share, the points that the panels have made. And then also, I'm not sure it's going to be recorded, but yeah. So please send any of your burning questions that you have via the chat box, and also on the live stream page, and do add your name and your affiliation. And then obviously the audience can upvote the questions that they think is relevant, so that they make sure that everybody sort of, the most voted questions we will try to address. We will also have a poll running. So if you look at Q&A every now and then, check out, and then make sure that you reply to the poll. And then we can also do a live posting of what is your perception and relationship with the questions that we're going to ask you. Also, you can tweet to us or about the event. So it's at Hoffman Center using the hashtag Reinventing Meeting. So the theme today is reinvention of meeting. So today we have our panelists to kind of talk us through their ideas, their work on this is how we transform meeting, work, and collaboration with others to harness new ways of sort of working, and how we can put this in practice, and how we probably will live like this in the future, so that we can move into a different kind of world. You would have seen in the slide deck that meeting face-to-face has quite a big environmental impact if we fly around the world for a unnecessary meeting or 2-hour meeting. So I think this massive lockdown actually made us rethink our relationship with, with all the meetings that we've had, the useful ones and the unuseful ones and the unnecessary ones. So there are a couple of numbers that I think our colleagues, our magic elves from the Hoffman Center, have shared before in terms of number of greenhouse gas emission, how much sort of commuting has required, and a couple of large tech companies already is moving into sort of flexible remote working. And at Chatham House, we're actively thinking about it as well. So I think this conversation today will help us sort of think about how we move into the new ways of working. So with us today, we have 3 really exciting speakers. We have Elizabeth Bieniek. She's the Director of Innovation at Cisco Collaboration, and she'll be touching on some of the new technologies that are coming our way that could change the face of meetings. Then we have Leila Alvin Lisbon, Head of Culture and Collaboration at Mural, and she will talk to us more broadly about the importance of engagement with remote teams and some of the innovations and tools that we can help to keep that behavior stick. And then we have Odd Locke. She's the Deputy Head of Policy and Research at the Royal Town and Planning Institute, and she'll be telling us more about some of the broader implications that changing the way we work might have on cities. Unfortunately, Bruce can't join us today. He's in some travel I don't know, some lockdown situation. So, but with us, we also have Josh Knowles. He will be live illustrating for us. So doing some of throughout the discussion today, we'll get to see his illustration. So the plan now is, how we're going to go spend the next hour together is each of the speaker will have about 5 to 7 minutes. And then before I open up for the whole audience, we will have about 10 minutes to sort of ask each other questions, have a chat. How does it actually also, I mean, how COVID has impacted us in our way of doing meeting. And so with that, I want to hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart because it's the space I work in and day out, working in a collaboration organization. When it comes to reinventing anything, be that rocket ships or toothbrushes, I think it's always good to start with who are the people that are going to use it and why. So when we're talking about reinventing meetings, starting with the people, like what we're doing right now, we're having a meeting that you normally have in person. We're now doing this over a webinar. So once you start with the people and what are the motivations of the people and what's the experience they're trying to create, then you can start layering things like technology changes and behavior changes and personal preferences and the global environment at large and what's happening right now. When we think about reinventing meetings, I really think about it in 3 different ways, and it's largely based on time horizons because that tends to be working in innovation. I tend to work in what's the immediate term, the near term, and the distant term. So when I think about the immediate term, where we are now, we're changing where we work. This whole concept of remote work has become real. Folks like myself who have worked remotely for years, it might not be as drastic of a change, but right now, because of the current world lockdown to an extent, we're having people who are working remotely who never did before, and we're experiencing remote work on a massive global scale. For better or worse, we're finding out what works and what doesn't. And with that, I think we're seeing certain things emerge. Security has come to the forefront of that and conversations of how do I be more secure? And we're seeing that a lot from organizations' perspective of looking at their employees and how do they protect them and how they protect their data. Looking at it, it's almost twofold. One is how do I be more secure with my now distributed workforce that a few months ago wasn't a distributed workforce. And so now that I have a high percentage of people who are logging in from outside of a traditional company building or firewall, how do I make that secure? So you're seeing things like multi-factor authentication and hardware security keys, and ultimately where that's going to move us towards embedded security. And I think we're going to start seeing things like end-to-end encryption becoming table stakes really for most collaboration technology. The second part of that is how do I make that security then simple and extensible? So this is something that's probably more invisible to the end user, but the companies that are offering these meeting collaborations are definitely thinking about this on the back end of as I'm having more people using home Wi-Fi or using mobile devices or perhaps working out of doors, how do I extend my security that is easy for my user to connect, but it's still keeping me secure? I think if we go a little bit farther out on the time horizon and look at the near future, we're changing not only where we work, we're changing how we work. And this is interesting as the technology is advancing in this space. The people themselves, again, thinking about this as a people-centric approach, people don't change. We are relational people. We like to interact. You mentioned if we were together face to face, we'd be having a drink as we're having this conversation. We like to laugh, gesture, facial expressions, the nature of how people interact. We are community-driven social creatures. And that part is really not going to change. What's interesting is as the technology is evolving, we're seeing things like augmented and virtual reality, which are really coming more to the center because they enable experiences remotely that you couldn't do previously. So the things that you can do now remotely that have a spatial type of interaction, something that replicates what you could do face to face when you're in a physical environment, that's something we're starting to see emerge in the AR VR space. In my organization, we've really taken this approach that we don't live in a flat world. So we live in a multidimensional world. So the technology and the tools that we use should be multidimensional as well. We are actually, my team has been building for a while now, and we have a current working prototype of a holographic meeting experience. We could be doing this meeting right now, and you could be a live hologram right in front of me. We could be sharing content back and forth. We could be interacting in that way. And that's something that's really exciting because it immediately shrinks the distance. It's also enables you to do things when you add technology to it that you couldn't do in a physical meeting. So if you think about if we were doing this remotely in a 3D virtual type experience, there are certain things that you could dial down. I could eliminate things like background noise, the clutter behind me, all those things that you don't want in a face-to-face experience. You can dial that down. What you can dial up, all the good stuff. I could improve my lighting, I can improve my audio, I can add in all these elements of, I could have a little list of additional augmented information that's overflowing. Oh, here's Anna's background, here's Lala's background. I could see all that detail while I'm talking to you. So how do you make an experience even better than it could be in person? And then when it goes beyond changing how we're working, looking at changing with whom we're working. And this is something that starts getting much farther into the distant future. But we've historically, I work in an organization called the Collaboration Organization. We have historically defined collaboration as working with someone to accomplish or create something. But that someone is changing, someone is becoming something. It could be another entity. It could be a bot, a machine. It could be some representation of artificial intelligence. I think when we get farther term out, we're seeing that evolution of, we started with very simplistic models, things like chatbots, and then we've moved into currently more sophisticated AI, like conversational AI with things like natural language processing. When we start looking farther out, I think we're seeing things like, how can we layer in elements of contextual awareness and social cues into our AI such that we are trying to get closer to socially intelligent AI? That might be a way out, but that is the direction that we're going. I think also with that, we're seeing a greater depth of social dynamics in our software. So not just binary conversations, but thinking about virtual remote conversations, you could have the same way as if we were all in a room together. You could drift in and out of conversations. You could be part of multiple conversations at once. It's not so binary. As we build that complexity into our virtual interactions, you're going to start to see that emerge. So just where I see this going, it's really on those time horizons, the short term, the immediate term, changing where we're working, near term, changing how we're working, and longer term, changing with whom we're working. And I think that's very exciting. But regardless of the time horizon, it's always going to be people first and people centric. So I think if we keep that in the forefront of our mind as we looked at reinventing meetings, that will be the direction we're going. So very exciting times.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think what stuck with me is the holographic meeting. So does that mean that we have to actually dress up? Because like right now, because it's so hot, I'm actually wearing shorts.
Well, you can filter, so you can start projecting your best version of yourself. That's what I think is exciting too.
I think that's interesting, which is like you can have avatars. Anyway, we can have that conversation later about all different kind of avatars. Layla, please.
Yeah, well, Elizabeth just ended on such a good note that it is an exciting time to see where everything is going. And of course, nobody could have imagined that this was going to happen and change how we worked. But for people who have been working in this remote workspace for so long, we could see, the trend was growing slowly, but then obviously it's just boomed, and it's just taken us all by surprise. And I think I can say this with more confidence now, that as the world is evolving, we're going to go more and more into a hybrid model of working, right? And for those who aren't familiar with what do I mean by a hybrid organization? So the way I see teams, you can have the co-located teams, who are locally all placed in one physical location. At Mural, where I work, we also talk about split teams. So you might have 2 or 3 offices, but everybody's co-located in those hubs. And then you have these hybrid or mixed teams, which include some people are co-located, some people are remote or distributed. And then you have the fully remote teams, which means that everybody is working from a separate location. So I have worked in a co-located company, more traditional, right? And then when I switched to working remotely, I went to a fully remote team, which was a completely different experience. Then I started, teaching people how to work remotely, and now I'm in a team that was co-located and has become hybrid even before COVID-19. And these hybrid teams are actually the most complex ones, because you're trying to merge 2 different environments and make them, meet somehow. And they will have their different habits and best practices in how we work. So there was actually there's many state of remote work reports, but the one that I remember now is one from Owl Labs, which is Owl Labs is a kind of webcam that shows people in like 360 degrees. So it's I haven't used it yet, but it's very interesting. So they said they had a report that showed that 30% of the workforce was fully remote all the time before COVID-19. And clearly, that's kind of flipped right now. And that's going to change the way we collaborate, right? So Elizabeth mentioned it really well. She mentioned some tools. She mentioned all this new technology, and I've sometimes assisted in some user research interviews from people who are building these kind of like holographic or different kinds of worlds that you could take part in, which I'm very excited about. At the same time, though, I think we need to sometimes take a step back and realize we can barely manage the tools that we have already sometimes, like people are still struggling with using Zoom, using Slack. So this is just for me. Sometimes I think before we even get into that virtual reality or maybe it's not for everyone, I think there's going to be some early adopters as always with technology, right? And so right now I think companies are struggling with how do you leverage these best practices for hybrid teams. And there's the tool side of things, but there's also the human side of things, right? And the first thing I think the first thing to remember is how can we be inclusive? This was a struggle also before when you're in a hybrid team. People who are co-located tend to kind of think for themselves, whereas when you're working remotely, you're used to having all these different channels with your teammates. So being inclusive means, whatever you're doing, especially in a meeting, try to make everybody have the same experience. So one rule we had, one best practice that many hybrid teams have is if one person is remote, everyone is going to pretend like they're remote, right? Come to a meeting and join from your own computer. Don't be like in a meeting room. And it's really going to change the way we engage with each other and the way we can relate to each other. And I've also seen organizations trying to recreate the physical space online somehow, or like the same guidelines that you had in your office before. And it's really important to realize if this is a new way of working, you're going to need new guidelines, new best practices, new rituals, new habits. So if you perhaps had a company meeting, I don't know, once a week before, maybe you want to rethink that, with like overlapping time zones, should we move it to once a month, for example? Is it because people maybe get more Zoom fatigue now, or there's just a lot of things to consider, and it's worth, for example, sending out surveys and asking people like what works for you, and really being empathic about people's personal schedules. If you do want to meet, it's not just, is it 10 p.m. for you and 9 a.m. for you, but it's like, how many meetings you have a week? Should we have, for example, a day in the week where we have no meetings, no online meetings? Should we, say that we're going to only invite specific people to the meeting who will then communicate everything to everyone else? And also, what tools are we going to use? There's a lot of new tools, well, not new, but some tools that are new for some people, right? So obviously a tool like ours, Mural, which is an online whiteboard, has been very useful now for people who want to collaborate visually. So all those teams who used to travel to their clients or in person to do workshops now need to find a substitute for that. So they might start using Zoom along with something like Mural so that they can have digital sticky notes and have like a very organic and intuitive way of working and collaborating. It's been really interesting to see how people adopt these new tools, and it will be a trial and error experiment, and even companies who have been working remotely for a long time, they have had to adapt. For example, when I joined Mural, we were 60 something, and now we're over 200. What used to work for us at 60 does not work for us anymore. So we're constantly adapting and iterating, and we realize our processes have to change every 3 months because something new comes up. So we have like an internal wiki now. We share best practices for meetings as well, and we also realize that doing asynchronous collaboration might be better than having meetings and meetings and meetings, right? So it's really important to think about that. Do we always need a meeting? Maybe not. I'm also very surprised when people say, oh, online meetings are terrible and I can't stand them. And it almost makes it sound like in-person meetings were really great before. So I always like really question, like, really? Were you really enjoying your meeting in your office before and you were coming and woo, all engaged? I don't believe that for a second. So I try to make online meetings really engaging and really fun. I always say, online meetings don't have to suck, basically. And a lot of that comes with preparation. So this is a message, and I don't know how much time I have left. Anna, maybe let me know if I'm rambling. One thing I will say is a skill that I really suggest everyone should have is facilitation. So before we would think facilitators are these people who maybe deliver a workshop and that's their role. But nowadays, everybody needs to know what online facilitation is. And it starts with, connecting with people, preparing an agenda before, making it really human and making sure that people don't feel so awkward, testing the tools, and also realizing if there is a facilitator and they drop out because their connectivity is not great, then somebody else can step in and take over. So there will be a link shared in the chat box. I wrote a blog post on online warm-ups and energizers because I think that's just such a great way. It's like kind of like an online icebreaker of starting a meeting and making sure that it's fun and that it's human. And I think I'm just going to wrap it up with this. A lot of people might think online meetings are dry because they just kind of, first of all, don't prepare anything, come like, there's awkward silence, and they forget that we're human beings and we need to still connect like we used to in the office. So I hope that that you'll take that away and remember to, connect with people and use that blog post as a starter.
Thank you. I think it's a really great reminder that when we used to be able to meet face to face, it wasn't always great. Sometimes some of the meeting actually did suck. So, so that we don't have this nostalgia of like the old golden days we used to be able to meet.
Those good old meetings.
Exactly. Odd, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. So what I want to touch upon really is perhaps the impact of digital meetings or the reinvention of meetings on the built environment, which is obviously a topic of interest. And I think that, well, there's been quite a lot of discussions about it already, but one of the things that we might witness, in fact, with the proliferation of digital meetings is the decline of the need for office space with more and more people working remotely, which in fact will affect small, medium, and large cities potentially in different ways. In fact, I think that the reduction of office space, if it happens on city, will very much depend on the types of services that the town or the city offers. Now, local town centers, for instance, may see more diversification of offer, more dining, more social activities, as people will at some point want to meet each other. Now, working from home in smaller town centers may also mean having access to workplaces in local town centers for some days, where smaller local office hubs, as you mentioned, Leila, the sort of the hybrid models might be developed. So all in all, in fact, local town centers might experience a growth from all that. Now, the contrary now could apply to larger cities where many activities can potentially be moved online. Cities typically offer financial services, research and learning activities, which then, of course, raises the important question of how could we reuse all those empty office space, all those empty buildings. Now, from a purely sort of planning, architecture, or design perspective, it's a little bit too early to actually say what we could be doing with those old empty premises, because actually the way companies feel about remote working is still actually quite mixed or ambiguous. It's true, and I think you mentioned it, Anna, already, that some companies such as Twitter or Facebook have announced that now staff can work from home indefinitely. It's also true that the CEO of Barclays said that it might be a thing of the past to put 7,000 people in a building. But more recently, and actually there was an article in the Wall Street Journal just last week, we've also seen companies saying that remote working isn't working for them. It's not so great for some companies because projects take longer, because collaboration is harder, because training new workers is a struggle. So some companies saying that in the long term, it might not be sustainable. So we just don't know whether or not companies are going to want to get rid of their old office premises or not. Now, also from sort of more sort of planning and built environment perspective, there are currently lots of debates, policy debates about converting all the office premises into homes, or now allowing further changings of building without full planning permission via what's called permitted development rights. Basically, you can transform an old office into a home without having to apply for planning permission. You cut down all the red tape and bureaucracy. Now, the transformation of old office premises into flats via what's called PDR has often actually resulted in poorly designed and located housing. If you live in the UK, you might be familiar with Newbury House in Ilford, which is in East London, which is absolutely a disgrace. Very small flats, almost without window. It's by the A12. It's absolutely horrible from a health perspective, from a sustainability perspective. It's absolutely appalling. Now, so the necessity to repurpose buildings will need to be now considered very carefully if this is the way we want to go. There will also be no quick and easy fixes. We need to make sure that adequate mechanisms are in place to guarantee that permission is not granted to schemes that then we will leave to regret. Now, I suppose echoing a point that also Leila made, but this time perhaps more from a built environment perspective, from a planning, from an architectural perspective, we should also perhaps resist the temptation to have a complete top-down approach. We've seen a lot of experts like me, including like planners, architects, public health professionals, having very strong and very sort of reasonable ideas about what future urban environment should look like in terms of cutting down traffic, for instance, in terms of having also sort of new houses and so on and so forth. But let's also perhaps not forget that everybody will have experienced the lockdown. People will have experienced changes. They will have experienced restrictions. They will have experienced new practices. They will know what worked for them and what didn't, in the same way that remote working might be working or not. And I think that an important part for experts, but also for policymakers, will be to listen to people.
Thank you. So before I open to everyone, but I think something that what you talk about our relationship or rethinking city design, and there are two things that really resonate with us. So we have this, so I'm going to plug something that we're doing at Chatham House. It's a partnership with the London Design Biennale. It's called Design in an Age of Crisis. And it is sort of this massive call for radical design thinking for four big topics. So one is around environment, one is around work, one's around health, and one's around society. And they're obviously, these issues are interlinked. So go to our website, you can check that out. But I think what you said, Odd, that made me think is there's quite a lot of thinking in terms of what the future of city look like. And something that I heard, I won't be able to quote the person properly, but I think what I want to share is the image of what the city center used to look like, which is a fried egg. So you have this sort of everything concentrated in the middle, and then you have everything spread out. And the future of city may look like a scrambled egg. So, and I love that concept, right? So that you have a different sort of relationship with city center, with your local neighborhood. And so this whole COVID make us have a completely different relationship with city. And obviously it touches on work. I mean, all these things is completely intertwined. So before I open for the audience to kind of send, so audience, please don't forget to, wherever you are with your glass of wine, do not forget to send your question. And we're gonna have a 5 minutes just, between us, like in terms of like questions that you want to ask, we want to ask each other. But in the meantime, I also want to pull out Josh's live drawing. So Josh has been doing this amazing drawing as Elizabeth, Leila, and Odd is talking. I'm not sure you can see, but yeah, we can see it. Okay. So anyway, so that is our way of, trying to emulate some kind of physical installation. Unfortunately, we can't send wine your way yet. So Elizabeth, Leila, and Odd, I mean, hearing each other, questions that you would want to ask each other. I have questions, but I kind of wouldn't want to, No question? Leila, please.
I have a question. Well, I have a question for both. I can start with Aude, maybe. What do you think about the future? Oops, I don't know if I'm frozen because everything froze on my side. No, it's all good. What do you think of the future of co-working spaces as they are now and how they might evolve later?
Sorry, Leila, the future of co-working spaces and how they might evolve.
Yeah.
I suppose it's again it's a little bit too early, because at the moment nothing is really changing. We haven't really seen any sort of major companies saying, this is it, we're going to make this major change, we're not going to rent this building anymore, we're going to sort of completely relocate, or we're going to have hubs. It hasn't happened. People have talked about doing it. Some companies are actually thinking that it's the right moment because this was on their agenda before, because perhaps they wanted to have some sort of action plans around climate change, and it is the appropriate time, but nothing has really happened. I think we will see some companies actually, yes, having most of co-working offices, having some smaller hubs, but at the moment we haven't really seen it. Now then, it's actually related to the point that you made, Anna, and your metaphor about the boiled egg and the scrambled eggs, which I think is a very nice metaphor. And
mine, but stuck with me, and I love it.
And again, I don't want to be the spoiled joy, or I don't know how you say it, but everyone's like, oh yeah, it's great. Let's have the 15-minute city, like the Paris model, which I actually think is a very interesting model. But let us not forget that, it's not because we have healthy cities with, cycling lanes and people able to walk, but it's going to suit everybody's needs. What if you are a woman with 2 children? What if you are elderly? What if you have severe disabilities? How do you get around? It's not going to solve all the problems anyway. So that's my point.
No, actually, it's very true. The fairness angle.
It's very important as well.
Absolutely true. Any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to. Oh, Elizabeth, please.
I have a question for Lila. You were commenting about how we have this sort of nostalgia for in-person meetings, and we need to remember we all complained about them before too. As you're noticing the transition of more online meetings, what have you really noticed as the biggest sticking points of people are struggling making that translation, or perhaps the flip of that? Where are you seeing where online might be superior in some cases?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I've seen people struggling with most is almost like a mindset. It's like even before you start, you go with the assumption that this is not as good as in person, So it's just like a lack of open-mindedness almost. And I noticed sometimes it's also a generational thing. If I think people who like millennials or even younger generations, Gen Z, whatever, they're, on FaceTime or whatever all the time. So they're like, sure, webcam, no problem. Like I'll turn it on. And with a lot of other people, I'm not saying it's just a millennial thing, but they don't want to put the webcam on. And already there is like, well, you're coming online and saying it's not like in person, but if you're not going to turn your webcam on, then you're not even trying to, that's the closest thing we have to being in person. Because then I can see your facial expressions. You can still I like to move my hands around. You can still see some of my body. So it's like, oh, I can't see body. I'm like, well, I've been in meetings where people complain and everybody had their webcam off. It's like not a surprise, I think also the advantage of online meetings is if you have a good facilitator is that you can get everybody to speak in the room because everybody's muted. I think it actually makes conversations more equal. And so it's not in a physical room, somebody who is also taking a lot of space from, with their personality, or also maybe they're just very big and maybe you're smaller, you're more introverted. In a physical space, you feel that much more. And I find that online, it's like we're all in this little thumbnail. So we're all much more similar, and you can also facilitate in a way. It's like, okay, we're all going to go and we're all going to call the next person to go. And I wonder even if in the future of meetings, if we do also meet in person again, we could actually take some of the best practices from the online world and then take them back to the in-person. I don't know, just
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm going to start reading the questions that audiences have submitted. And I have one which is sort of building on Leila's point on, so from Dr. Roll, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher your last name, Vertigo. So anyway, it's your question that matters. So psychology suggests that most conferencing systems fail in regulation of emotion. So will this affect how we work? Will we adapt? Or will the technology be improved? Who wants to take that? Oh, maybe I'll take another one. And I think we can probably sort of have a more, yeah, here has a one, what kind of best practice can foster inclusivity and effectiveness? And I want to put in one, which is I think we've been pondering ourselves, because I think for those who come to Chatham House meeting, a lot of what we do, some of the discussion happen, you can translate into a virtual meeting, but there is a lot of, there are certain types of meeting that we hold is based on a high trust environment. And then so unless you start with a group that already has a high trust, how do you build that very important sort of element of trust that you can't quite sort of, I find it quite difficult to do that in a virtual space. So those are sort of three questions in the same bucket, and you can take however you want to take it. Elizabeth.
I have a comment on that I'd like to jump in on. So that's all related to what I was talking about, what we've been prototyping around holographic meeting experiences. And again, to Lila's earlier point of it doesn't apply to everyone. Not everyone in for every meeting, like, let's jump into a holographic meeting. But in certain cases where it's very important to see the other person, gauge their facial reactions, be able to show spatial awareness and context, be able to share content, perhaps get inside of that content, that becomes very important. And one thing that was very interesting to us when we were doing user testing and earlier customer feedback, this idea of trust came up a lot because the situation we have right now, you're basically feeling as if you were sitting across the table from someone and you don't have the distance that you have of a screen. When you have a screen, you're very aware that I'm here, you're there, there's a physical piece of hardware between us. When you have someone who is projected into your space and it's a photorealistic quality and it's in real time and you make a joke and they laugh and they point at something over here and you can see that, you lose that barrier. And that was something a few people commented on, of the ability to build rapport, the ability to establish trust happens much quicker because you feel as if you are physically sharing space with them. Where we notice this, almost a funny anecdote of the way we notice it too, is we changed the ending of our meetings in that rather than just ending a call, a lot of people were reacting to the like, oh, where'd they go? And it became that very realizing that they felt like they were actually in that room with them. So we had to have a softer ending of that, more of a fade out rather than a harsh ending. But that ability to establish trust seems to stem a lot from that feeling of, are we in the same space? Are we in this together? And there are certain things I think around holograms that you can actually get to that. Now you made the point before on about avatars, and I think avatars could be used in certain scenarios. I'm much more pro actual person, seeing the other person. So I can see when you're smiling, I can see when you're laughing, I can see when you're showing doubt, when you're not sure. I want to see all those micro expressions because that is the richness of the dynamics of the conversation. That's how you build the trust.
I think I meant it's like my face, but like virtual different outfits. Yeah, exactly. So I don't have to spend a lot of money on the different clothes.
We've talked about that actually. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Okay, excellent. So you don't have to actually spend that money. You just spend an extra money. A new outfit from, I don't know, your favorite brand. Sorry, digression. Did you want to come in on what we talked about on the more psychological human element, social element of it? No.
Sorry, me?
Yeah, just wanted to know whether you wanted to comment on.
I mean, it's not really very much where my area of expertise really lies in. I'm more an expert on research and the built environment. I suppose. I mean, just talking this time not as an expert, but from sort of personal experience. Again, I suppose people will have different expectations. And again, I think it's a bit too soon again to see the real impact on having digital meetings, online meetings, on the amount of that we have currently. We need to wait a little bit. I can just sort of take the comparison with my husband, who, not being a researcher, like, has had to adapt. And it seemed to me that we're not all equal. Some people actually, as you were actually saying, Elizabeth, will adapt more quickly, it'll be easier for some, and some people will actually struggle. I would like to see the sort of some strong studies on the impact on on psychology, actually.
Yeah, so actually there was a question on here, which group have proven to be least receptive to long-term remote by age, by status, gender. So do you know of any studies, or you think that it's too early for us to have enough data points?
I think it's a bit early, but what I've actually seen in the media and taking part to other panels is also the impact of remote working on gender. It looks like women have been the women's productivities have actually been affected a lot more severely than men's productivity. So we should be also very careful with that and look at the impact of remote working on women's as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have friends with kids and they have like homeschooling and all the other things. It's definitely complicated.
If I can just add something, I think it's interesting because remote work as it is now in a pandemic time, in lockdown, like you mentioned, homeschooling, for me doesn't represent what remote work has been for like the past decade. So it's just a very important point I want to bring also to the audience. You know, usually if your kids were at school, I mean, remote work actually would, I've seen other research, Odin, and it may be early to see what it's doing like on a mass scale, but there's been companies that have been remote for like years now, like fully remote. So I'm sure there's a research there. And I've seen that productivity has actually been much higher in fully remote teams for women, for men, when they were living in a non-pandemic situation. So I think there's like two situations also to look at, right?
I actually agree with Leila. I think that we're living in extreme circumstances. It might not be a representation of what remote working would be in normal circumstances. I just wanted to say that we actually happen to run an academic journal also at the RTPI, Planning Theory and Practice. And what we have noticed though throughout the lockdown period is that the submission by women researchers has dropped down a lot, in fact, during the lockdown. So yeah, it's nothing, you know, that you can take as face value saying, oh, you know, it has had a massive impact on gender, but still it is an indication that there might be something there, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think on the point of sort of fairness and equality and access, and I mean, we're talking from a context of a developed country, you know, but I think we have a question here from Matt Wright from IED saying, any suggestion for how to collaborate effectively digitally with people and organizations, especially with developing countries that have limited and unstable, expensive internet access?
I think that's where the asynchronous collaboration really steps in, which is something I mentioned earlier. So I think there's this kind of like
elaborate more on the concept, because it's quite new.
Yeah, so asynchronous, so there's like two types of collaboration. When I say I mean, there's many types, right? But synchronous means in real time, like what we're doing now, we're all talking at the same time, we're on the same Zoom call. And asynchronous would be that we work at our own time, and we might overlap a little bit and do synchronous work, but then the rest of the time we do our own separate work, and then we loop each other into what we're doing. So this works very effectively asynchronous when people are in very distant time zones. Like at Mural, we have a span of 9 different time zones, but you might have more if we went into Far East Asia, right? So we're not going to expect somebody in New Zealand to collaborate with somebody who is on the West Coast. It would just be it doesn't make sense. So there's almost like a passing the baton thing where maybe people in Asia would overlap for 3-4 hours a day with people in Europe, depending on where they are. And then I would say even 2-3 hours is enough. And then you would, then people in Europe would overlap with people in the West Coast and pass information on. And it's all about processes, I think. So in this case, for people working in developing countries, I would suggest really try to find the process that works for you. You know, what does that look like? It's not so much about the tools, but it's if you're doing something that can be done, you know, we start when it's our morning, we pass it on to you, you take it on, and we maybe we try to make decisions using, for example, a platform where we're going to track all our notes. So it could be maybe we're using a project management platform like Asana or Trello. We update each other there, we tag people, and we have a very defined process of when you're done, you know, mark it as done, pass it on and things like that could work well.
I would agree about the asynchronous. That tends to work best. I had a very real situation happen in this case where I had a innovation brainstorming plan for a counterpart in Africa, and she lost power for 36 hours. We just couldn't do it. So there's definitely a real challenge to do that live and in real time, but we ended up having to do some communication asynchronously. To mirror some of what Lila said, the same thing. I work in a small team. There's 20 of us, but we're spread across 4 countries, 9 hours spread in time zones. And a lot of what we do is asynchronous. Yeah, you're posting things at all different hours of the day, and you don't have to worry about, oh, am I online when this other person is online? Because we're all in different time zones. So it works very well to carry on the conversation. You do now and then have to all meet, I think, at the same time in order to talk live. But that is always a challenge, I think, of global meetings, because as much as you can solve the distance, you can't solve the time zones.
And
but
to
I think,
the point,
go ahead.
Sorry, to the point of building trust, one thing that we didn't mention before, but I think trust is built on the one hand, yes, meeting people, whether it's a holographic thing or something else, but just delivering on what you said you would do. For example, if you said, I will hand this in by, that time, and you constantly deliver, commit to that, you're building trust. And meeting in person will build trust. Talking about things that are not related to work will build trust, but like you can do all that asynchronously as well. So they all kind of overlap, is what I'm trying to say, right? Like we think sometimes collaboration is one thing and building trust is another thing. Actually, you're building trust as you're collaborating.
Yeah.
I think that talking about things that are not work is actually very important. And I think that's something a lot of people are realizing now, of what people are missing when they're working remotely now is those water cooler conversations, the how's your weekend? Like, what do you do with the kids this weekend? And that's something I had to actively build that into our schedule with our team, even though a lot of our team worked remotely before. Once everyone went fully remote, we started scheduling, a weekly coffee hour or wine hour. And the only rule was you can't talk about work. And it was just a chance to talk about anything, kind of just have that back and forth with your colleagues. And that made a huge difference when it just comes to morale and that feeling of camaraderie. And I think that is very important. And you likely talk about that, Lila, and some of the things that you posted, but I think that ability to just be human, be a person with another person, and not just focus on, all right, here's our meeting, our time agenda, all right, done. You need to build in time for just communication.
Yeah, that is, yeah. I mean, we experimented as the Hoffman team to have a hangout time. So we know every Thursday for 2 hours, we don't actually need to speak with each other. But we all have for those who are not in a meeting, we have all of our video on Teams. But it's almost like a pretend that everybody is working at the same time. And then every now and then it's like, so it's almost emulating something. It's like, oh, so-and-so, what about this? And it gave us a little bit of a sense of like team every now and then, but it is sort of how do we, bring some of the physical meeting into some of the online meeting. We have 10 more minutes. I think there are sort of 2 big questions that groups of questions that I think one is sort of this balance between productivity, mental health, the sort of creeping into our personal life, especially when you talk about your concern, it's like you're like, oh my god, I need to reply to this, right? So like that sort of the 9 to 5 now become, for me, my mind became so fluid that I don't know how to like whether we can kind of talk about this. And I think there was a second group of questions, which is maybe towards the end, about sort of the future technology, what's coming our way, and trends. So let's talk about the well-being and sort of the work-life balance, mental health angle of it. Anybody want to come in?
I see we're all smiling on that one. I feel like it's pretty
I'm sure we all feel it, but we don't want to talk about it.
Pretty relevant to all of us. I was just thinking, personal experience. I have a full-time job. I have, as I mentioned, a team that's remote, and I have 3 kids who are 5 and under. So it's never really been a 9 to 5 or just fit it into those boxes. I think a lot of that applied before this whole scenario of even going in person to an office, of how do you segment and how do you balance that? It's interesting. I think what's most interesting to me now is seeing everyone go through that that experience of, I think it was Lila mentioning that people working from home, it's not the normal working from home. Usually your kids would be in school, and it would be a little bit more structured and a little less chaotic. So I think everyone's experienced that right now. I know my company has been very vocal to our employees of saying, managers, work with your employees on a flexible schedules, understand that people are trying to juggle a lot of things at once. We're doing life at the same time that we're doing work. If somebody needs to step out for a few hours in the middle of the day, let them step out for a few hours in the middle of the day. It's more important that things get done rather than everyone be on at the same time, because that's just the situation we're in. I think that will calm down a little when we return closer to some sense of normalcy, but that's definitely been a challenge. I'd like to know why Odd and Lila were smiling.
I'm smiling because, in fact, we've actually just published a report on the topic, which is called Enabling Healthy Placemaking. And in fact, I think, again, this catastrophe, this crisis is in fact a great moment just to rethink the way, or the places we live, work, and meet, and really put back all the healthy principles of healthy placemaking back at the heart of where we live. Because when we're confronted to situations such as a pandemic, we very much realize how important it is to have a decent home, a decent place to live. And in fact, what I wanted to say is that, there are like lots and lots of principles of good, healthy placemaking around, and they've been around for forever, since the 19th century, since the emergence of planning as a profession, which actually emerged out of pandemics. And we know that, people need like a decent space standard, but we know that, if you have like access to green spaces, well, even in a lockdown situation, your mental health will improve, and so on and so forth. I think it's a crucial time now to translate all those principles into practice, really. I think it's been enough, perhaps, research and discussions. It's time to really move the debate forward. And that means, in fact, a collaboration between people, between public health experts and professionals of the built environment, but also with other professionals. And the fact that now we know that remote working is working under certain circumstances, well, it's the time to do it more than ever.
Yeah. So we have now another yes, well-being, mental well-being is a very live conversation that we have with, I'm just feeling like I'm, treading to funny waters now. Yeah, but I think it's really, really important. In the end, it's about, I think one question that we didn't quite talk about, but I'm kind of afraid I'm opening a whole can of worms before we kind of actually need to wind down, which is, how do you build your network if you're not meeting face to face?
Online?
Online.
I'm happy to say what's worked for me. I find that it's actually an advantage to be online or not be able to meet face to face. So an example, I used to be based in London, and I'd go to these events at the beginning, very naively thinking I'm going to be networking, and I felt like everybody was there to take advantage of that event, leave. And sometimes it's great, but it would take a while, you kind of like beat around the bush, ask these polite questions, chit chat, and then maybe you come away with like one or two good contacts. And when you're online, I feel like you have the whole world in front of you. So I just go on Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm just like super direct, like, hey, I want to connect with you because this and this and this. Let's have a virtual coffee. And I find also if you're a bit introverted, it's actually much easier. And I don't have to commute 45 minutes anymore to go to the opposite side of London and be like, oh, I came all the way here and I didn't meet anybody this time. But sometimes I did, but like, I think that it does take initiative, right? Like it comes from you reaching out to people. And then there's also like networking events. I go to one called Workplaceless that is organized by a company. Network Placeless that's organized by Workplaceless. And they have a virtual event to connect with people who are interested in remote work. So I can recommend that, because each time you go, it's like, I think it's once a month, there's a different topic and you see different people, and then people reach out to each other on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So the next, Elizabeth, do you want to say anything?
I was just going to chime in on that one too and say networking is one-on-one. It doesn't matter if you're going to an event or whatever the case is, networking happens one-on-one. So I would agree that I think the current situation doesn't make it any harder. In some cases, it actually makes it easier, because in order to build your network, unless you're having that face-to-face conversation, and I use the concept of virtual coffee all the time as well, I think that's a great way. And right now, with everyone working from some sort of home office, the willingness to accept a 15-minute virtual coffee, I feel, is a little bit higher than normal.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. So the last 3 minutes before I have to do a 1 minute closing, it's looking at the future. So there are a couple of questions here. Do you think the working from office approach is from the 19th century? And so what would the 21st century look like? And in a way, it's like, are there any trends of technology on the horizon that you think is coming and that can lead to widespread adoption? And I think there was a question at some point, or maybe I sort of read into it, when will the hologram meeting be available?
Do you want to start in order? Because I think that first question is really up odds.
The 19th century. Do you think?
Do you think we'll go back to offices? I'm kind of curious to know what your research is telling you.
I don't know. Does anybody? What do you think, Odd?
I actually think it's going to be some sort of hybrid model. I think that not all companies are going to want to sort of have all their workforce outside the office or decentralized or working from home. I actually don't think that some professions can actually do it. A lot of professions, you actually have to be face to face with people. And seeing this article in the Wall Street Journal last week, I actually think that some companies are starting to question the effectiveness of remote working on people's productivity and other aspects as well. So I think there will be a cost benefit analysis, in fact, and what works for companies, that if they're making profit and having people working remotely, they do it. If not, well, they will cut down on it. Overall, I think, yeah, as I said, it'll be a hybrid model, I think.
Future trends, future technology.
I think we talked of a few of those a little bit earlier. I think obviously I focused a lot on that in the last question there on the holographic meetings. I mean, when is it available? My team is doing it today. So, I mean, the technology is there today. When will it become a product? I'm not allowed to comment on that.
Okay. So that means that I cannot next year choose my online outfit and say, let's have a holographic Reinventing Meeting 2.0, and then what does it look like?
I do think what's been interesting, though, is because of all the events, the conferences and everything have become virtual, there's been this huge scramble to play with technology and find out, how can I have a virtual conference and have sidebars and have hallway conversations? And the pace that we're seeing the technology evolve is much more rapid than normal because the need is so great. So I do think we're going to see a lot of advancements come out within the next 6 to 18 months.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry. I was just going to add one more thing that's kind of related to work as well, but I think we're going to be more accepting of informal and people having personal lives, because, for example, now you can see my room, I can see in your house, that wasn't the case before, right? And because remote work allows you to be flexible, it will probably allow people to maybe move out of cities and go to places they want to live in, to lead the lifestyle that they want to live. So even though that's not directly connected to work, I think it will bring hopefully a better work-life balance with time as people get used to finding their rhythm.
Odd, do you want to make a comment on that? Also, maybe you can think what would help with how do you make adoption.
Well, I'm always the one who's bringing the bad news. Actually, it's a very attractive idea to stuff we're all working in stuff for remote areas, moving into the countryside, and why not? The problem is that if we do that, it might not be actually sustainable, because high density actually we're not depleting all resources, and it's perhaps a little bit counterintuitive, but having a lot of people in a building is actually more energy efficient than having everyone working remotely. If you think in terms of how we need to keep our houses warm and electricity and so on and so forth. So is that really desirable? I don't know.
That's an absolutely excellent comment to sort of close this. So before you go, two things. Josh has been doing some amazing drawings. So please just share, he's been capturing the discussion that we've had so far. I can see some very interesting, my name and different people's name, what we say, some really interesting words there, reinventing the meeting. And so keep an eye just for our next meeting. So keep an eye out for the future reinventing that coming towards the end of the year. We have planned reinventing travel. We were going to do reinventing travel in March, and then we kind of like, I think we're in the middle of it. We don't actually know what it looks like. So we kind of pushed it to September. So keep an eye out for that. And also Chatham House has an annual Future of Work conference, and it will be taking place online through Chatham House Live series. So this is a very topical issue for us. I mean, we live it all the time, and also because it does affect us as a society, and it does affect how resources are used and planned. So with that, I thank you so much for joining us on the Reinventing Dialogue. I hope you can grab a glass of wine, Elizabeth, maybe in 4 or 5 hours. But thank you so much. It was great. See you all very soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.